Next, we'll move on and hear from Mr. Charles W. King for 10 minutes.
My name is Charles W. King. I'm the president of the economic consulting firm of Snavely, King, Majaris, O'Connor, and Lee. Who, you wonder, is Snavely, King, Majaris, O'Connor, and Lee? We're a small consulting firm, been in business for 35 years. Our general subject areas are three: telecommunications, public utilities, and transportation. Our principal activity is the preparation and presentation of expert witness testimony in regulatory cases. Our client base are users of these three industries. Principal telecommunications client is the federal government. Our principal utilities clients are state-funded consumer advocates or public service commissions. And our principal transportation clients are shippers. I am not a transportation expert. I am in the utility area, but I testify in public utility cases on the subject of rate of return, among other things. But in the last, you'll find the list in my statement, the last 5 years I've testified in 14 separate cases on rate of return. As we speak, I am preparing rate of return testimony in 4 cases, 2 in Maryland, 1 in Missouri, and 1 in North Dakota. I'd like to look first at the finding that this board made last month, or maybe 2 months ago, concerning the rate of return for the railroads. That return on equity was 15.8%. And the question is that a reasonable return in comparison with other estimates? We have in this slide a comparison of the 15.8% with experienced returns. The Ibbotson experience returns for period 1926 through 2003, and you see that's 12.4%. 71 through 2003, 13%. And S&P's index, I believe this was just the last few years, 12.84%. So your estimate, the board's estimate of railroad return is significantly above overall market returns experienced. Now let's look at estimates of future market returns. These are the return estimates that were produced by the utility witnesses in 4 of the cases that I have participated in. As you've heard, one of the requirements of the CAPM method is an estimate of the aggregate return of the entire market, and these are those aggregate returns, presumably looking forward. As you see, they range from 11 to 13.9%, and even the 13.9%, though, is a full percentage point plus another 28 basis points, so that's 128 basis points below this board's estimate of the equity return for the railroads. Now, this difference would be justifiable if we had any evidence that the railroads were significantly more risky than the market in general. But there is no such evidence, and quite the reverse. These are 2 measures that come out of Value Line. Value Line's beta is used more by utility experts than any other beta. I don't know that it necessarily is the better one, but it certainly is the one in the most use in rate of return cases. So I presented that here. As you see, the railroads average about at the market average. The other thing that Value Line produces is a safety rating, which is a measure of investor risk. Here, the railroads average 2.25. The market average is 3.0. And I think we can conclude from this that the railroads are not more risky than the market. In fact, there is evidence that they may be less risky. Another comparison is the overall cost of capital. In examining analyst reports, I found that at least 2 analyst organizations have estimated the cost of capital. This is aggregate cost of capital for the individual railroads. And here you see their estimates. Now, Citibank is quite low. They're in the range of 6.1 to 6.3%. Legg Mason estimates a little higher, range from 8% up to 9.2%. But all of those are dramatically lower than the board's finding as to the individual railroad's aggregate cost of capital using its formula. As you see, those estimates range from 11.84 to 12.87 and average at about 12%. So how is it that the board's DCF formulation produces such a very, very high estimate of equity cost and overall capital costs? Well, one of the reasons is the DCF formula itself. As you see, it consists of these two elements, growth and dividend yield. Dividend yield for the railroads is very small. It's only 1.5%. Were investors only interested in dividend yield, they wouldn't buy railroad stocks. What they buy it for is growth. And the board's estimate is 13.66%, which is derived from the forecast produced by Ibbotson Associates of analyst estimates. Now, why do these analysts estimate such a high growth rate? Well, I've been through all of the analysts, not all of them, but a lot of the analyst studies of the railroad industry and individual railroads. And here are 5 principal reasons that they find that the railroads will grow dramatically. Motor carrier problems, high fuel costs, and shortage of drivers. This produces headroom for price increases that has not existed in the past. Also the growth in long-haul intermodal, driven largely by Asian imports coming into the West Coast. There's been a significant improvement in train scheduling so that we're getting better utilization out of the fleets, and then frequently cited is weak regulatory constraints. And I'll have more on that later. But the characteristic of all of these, with the possible exception of the last one, is that they will not last forever. The motor carrier problems, even if they get worse, sooner or later, the advantage of the railroads over the motor carriers will exhaust itself. And with that exhaustion will come the exhaustion of the headroom for price increases. Sooner or later, the railroads will increase prices to the point that shippers can't stand it, and their traffic will fall off, and their rate of increase in earnings will decline. And that's true of the other items. Those are all short-term, 3 to 5 year effects. And that is what drives the 13.66% forecast. And that's why I have recommended in my statement that the Commission adopt the FERC two-step earnings growth formulation. Now, we had concern expressed a minute ago on how one should weight the short term and the long term. I don't know that FERC has got it right necessarily, but what they do is weight short term 2/3 and long term 1/3. And this this modifies the rate of growth to a level that's more reasonable and acceptable. Here you see the 13.66 that this board has adopted, weighted 2/3, and the Congressional Budget Office forecast of GDP growth of 4.5%. That is their long-term forecast, and that's weighted 1/3. And you get a growth rate of 10.61%. When you add the 1.52% dividend yield, you get an equity return of 12.13%. Now, 12.13 is high, but it is well within the range of the overall market returns that I had cited in 2 previous slides, of 12.4 to 13% for experienced returns to equity, and forecast returns to equity of 11 to 13.9%. So that is my recommendation with regard to the equity return. When we get to the issue of how we should put together the equity return and the debt return, we have to go to the problem of circularity. This board has announced that there is no circularity, and this is some time back. Maybe it was the ICC, and the reason was, I believe it was the ICC prior to the formation of this board. And the reason was the commission found that there was no effect of their regulation on the profitability of the railroads because most of the traffic, 70% of the traffic, is unregulated by reason of the fact that it is below a threshold of 180% revenue over variable cost. That's true of revenue, but it's not true of operating profit. Operating profit is about 2/3, 1/3 the other way. Most of the operating profit is from traffic above 180% RVC. And that means that, in fact, the past perception that the railroad profitability is not affected by regulation may require revisiting. And it may require revisiting particularly in light of the substantial increases that are being imposed on traffic that is above 180, which will drive the red portion of that right-hand bar to an even larger percentage. Now, there are two ways in which the board's treatment of its rate of return calculation affects that rate of return the board's calculation of rate of return affects the profitability of the railroads, which in turn affects the board's calculation of rate of return. First, because we have weak regulation, there is substantial headroom for the railroads to increase highly profitable traffic by even more percentages. And the reason that they can do so is that all but one of them are found to be revenue inadequate. And that creates a high earnings forecast because, as you noted, the analysts find substantial headroom, weak regulatory constraints, and therefore expect significant increases in earnings. The other way in which the board's approach to finding rate of return influences the railroads is through the market valuation of the equity to debt ratio. The board uses current market values for equity and debt. Because the railroads are profitable, they have high stock prices, which gives them high market equity valuations, which then flow into the DCF formula, the compositing of equity and debt for the purpose of capital estimates, capital cost estimates, and that in turn creates further profitability. Now, the solution to the circularity, which I believe exists, first, we can limit the effect of high earnings forecasts by using the FERC two-step procedure. Second, we can eliminate the impact on the capital structure coming from market value by reverting to the book value weighting that was used by the Interstate Commerce Commission prior to about 1990. So my final recommendations are to continue to use the DCF formula, to determine the cost of capital for the railroads, adopt a two-step procedure used by FERC for identifying the growth factor, and use book value of debt and equity in determining the capital structure of the railroads. When you do that, applied retrospectively to 2005, the equity return is 12.13, well within the range of equity returns of the overall market, and the total return is 8.99%, and that's well within the range of capital cost estimated by the analysts back in slide 4. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. King. We'll next proceed with Mr. John Ficker, representing the National Industrial Transportation League. Welcome, Mr. Ficker, and please proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, Mr. Mulvey. It's good to be here again. And I think if my reflections are accurate, this will probably be the last testimony in this building by anybody before a hearing, because I think your move is shortly to happen. So I take with great distinguishment that I'd be the last person testifying before this august board in this august room. So thank you. My notes here say good morning, but I think it's afternoon now, so I'll amend that part of my testimony. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the economic education I've had here this morning. I am not an economist. I make no claim to be an economist. I always relish the fact that people understand this so much better than I do, and it's really an opportunity for me to learn a lot here this morning. But I want to talk about really one thing and then give you a few thoughts about it. I represent those who move the goods and commerce in this country, and nothing is more important to us than have a healthy, viable, financially strong transportation industry. Rails, air, ocean, highway. It all is important to be strong. Our country depends on it. Freight transportation is the circulatory system of our economy, and unless we have a strong transportation system, then our economy will suffer as a result. But in that debate, in that discussion, there must be balance. And I think that's what this proceeding is all about, finding a balance between those who use the system and those who provide the services in order for everyone to feel that they're getting the best benefit from the system. You all know the League, and I won't go into a great deal of history about the League, except to say one thing. We are proud, and quite proud today, to say that this is our 100th anniversary. 1907, a group of traffic men got together in Chicago and formed the National Industrial Traffic League on August 2nd, and we're proud to say that this year we will celebrate our 100th anniversary. Lots of our League members are involved in rail transportation, and rail has been at the heart of this organization from the very beginning, and that's why we're here today. According to the statute, as I understand it, the board is to maintain and revise as necessary the statute required to determine revenue adequacy. And I think that's why this proceeding is so important, because at the heart of revenue adequacy is the cost of capital. There's clear evidence, though, today that what we have is slightly out of balance. And I listened to those who testified previous to me, and again, I learned an awful lot, that what's going on in the board's recommendation and the board's output is significantly different from what the marketplace is determining the rail industry to achieve. And that's where I believe we need to step into balance. And let me give you a couple of examples that kind of cite this. First, the board's current methodology led to a finding in 2005 that out of the 7 Class 1 railroads, only the Norfolk Southern was revenue adequate. And I have a terrible abomination for that word, because revenue adequacy to John Q. Public and revenue adequacy in this room are two different meanings, absolutely. But the conclusion contrasts to what the financial community says. For example, Jim Valentine, who was a noted Morgan Stanley rail industry analyst, estimated that in 2005, CN, BNSF, NS, CP were all earned their cost of capital. And Scott Flowers, another respected analyst, similarly predicted that the CN's rate of return on invested capital in 2005 would exceed its cost of capital, and that CP's cost of capital was in the same range as its return on invested capital. 5 out of the 6 of the major Class 1 railroads were predicted to earn their cost of capital in 2006. Yet, despite these reports by various respected analysts, the board's methodology resulted in a declaration in 2005 that in BNSF, CN, and CP were all still short of earning their cost of capital. If the board continues to follow this methodology, it's likely we'll have a similar thing for 2006. I have to say as a sidebar that last year I was in this very hearing room for some event. I can't recall what it was. I think it was retirement. Excuse me, I'm fighting a bit of a cold. And I was talking to the previous chairman, and he was very concerned about the reports that were initially coming back on the rate of return for the railroad, saying he sent the staff back to rework them over and over again because he couldn't understand why the cost of capital they were showing below the threshold for revenue adequacy, whereas Wall Street was saying something entirely different. But that's just a sidebar. The second reason for this inconsistency is that the internal indications of the board's methodology is in need of repair, and my previous testifiers fairly well indicated that. And again, I'm not an economist, and I don't want to jump into whether a DCF model or what's the other one, CP? CAPM, thank you. Whether those are the right approaches. But the question about is the right approach or the wrong approach Do you use the same approach over and over and over and over again? Our economy evolves, our country evolves, and I think you should take a hard and serious look at that. Here's an example that was pointed out to me. The CN and BNSF were about as far away from revenue adequacy in 2005 as they had been in 2004, despite significant jumps in their returns. The reason for this odd result was that the agency's cost of capital determination increased from 10.2% in 2004 to 12.2% in 2005, a 20% increase in the cost of capital in a single year, in the absence of an increase in inflation or any other circumstances that would explain such an increase. Finally, the League would note that all the parties to this proceeding, both the railroads and shippers, have an interest in an accurate determination of cost of capital. No one is here proposing things to be anything but. The League supports and will continue to support a strong, financially viable rail industry. But the League believes that the board standards for measuring their financial health should be accurate and in tune with the judgment of financial markets. Therefore, the League urges the board to undertake a reexamination of the methodology used in determining the rail industry's cost of capital and the methodology for calculating rail carriers' individual rates of return. The League does not at this time take any specific position on specific methodology. We'll leave that to the experts. The League urges the board to seriously consider the suggestions that were presented and initiated in this rulemaking, and I thank you for the time that you've given me. I hope I was in my 5.
Thank you, Mr. Ficker. We appreciate your efforts getting here. I know you were doing some travel this week, as were many. In
transportation, I got stuck in Chicago for 2 extra days.
Similarly, I want to thank Dr. Hodder for coming from Madison, if I heard correctly.
That's correct.
Well, welcome to spring break here down in balmy 25 or whatever it is out there. So a few questions, if I could. Let's see. I guess with Mr. Motes, you perhaps were the first witness, just by luck of the draw, to use the phrase today. Not a new one to us, of course, but revenue adequacy. I took a note that you added a couple important words just before those 2 words, long term. I just want to make sure I understand. Or is the phrase long term revenue adequacy in statute or in case law or regs? I'm still only 6-7 months into the job. I want to make sure I get the benefit of your knowledge, what you meant when you said long term, how meaningful is that, and perhaps help us with what you would see as long term.
Chairman Nottingham, the term long term is not in the statute, but this agency, the ICC and the STB, have, put it this way, long recognized that revenue adequacy, if and when a particular railroad company achieves the target number in a given year, is not a short-term concept. It has to be sustained. How long is long-term? I think everyone at this table and everyone we represent have debated that, in many different fora for many years. There has never been an occasion, to my knowledge, where this agency has been called upon to determine whether a particular railroad had achieved long-term revenue adequacy. Now, whether that may be an issue before you in the next several years, frankly, I only hope so, because I hope that we're going to have the kinds of returns for the various Class 1 railroads that are members of the AAR that'll cause us to come to grips with that problem. But the short answer is, again, it is not in the statute, but it has been recognized by this agency for a number of years. And I think the economists would all agree that hitting a particular number in a given year, 1 year, maybe even 2 years, whatever, would not be meaningful in itself. The ability to sustain the level of revenues to achieve the kind of capital that the railroads must compete for, not just among themselves, but with all the other components of the economy, is what we're talking about.
Thank you. Ms. Rosenberg, would you care to touch on that? If we were, in your experience, if we were to be asked to look at revenue adequacy, do you anticipate that we would be asked to do so in a long-term fashion? Or?
I would agree with Mr. Motes that the prior agency formulations, it has been in terms of long-term revenue adequacy and avoiding a situation where it fluctuates 1 year it is and one year it isn't. But by the same token, I think it's possible, and it should be a determination that's made prospectively. If you get to a certain point and it looks like the conditions are stable, then you don't have to wait 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years to get confirmation of what's already set there. And we would also take issue with the statement that there's something waiting to happen. If you calculate the cost of capital properly, at least properly in our view, and you look at what the returns have been, I think you've got a case that some of the carriers are there now, and I think that's what Wall Street is recognizing as well.
Thank you. Mr. King, your presentation, you touched on a series of developing market indicators, developments in the freight rail market. One of the points you made was that there has been in recent years improved train scheduling performance practices. It's not every day that I hear a distinguished, articulate shipper representative talk to me about improved train scheduling performance. I want to give you a chance to elaborate on that. It's refreshing.
The citation was to the analyst reports, and I was merely drawing out of those reports, and there's dozens of them that I reviewed, the main points that they were making, and improved train scheduling was one of them, and it translates into greater efficiency. I can't speak from any personal knowledge as to the nature of that improved train schedule, although I'm sure my partner Tom O'Connor could. And as a consequence, I'm afraid I can't shed much further light on this particular topic.
Thank you. Mr. Motes, on the issue of improved, in your experience working with the industry, do you see that that's an accurate description of developments in the railroad market?
Yes, I do. I think it's been well publicized, and I think the shipping community is well aware of the fact that I think all of the major North American railroads are, obviously be careful about all, the vast majority of the major Class 1s now are attempting to run, and as I understand it, running successfully in most cases, scheduled services, particularly scheduled services for industry segments. Initially, I think it was focused on intermodal, the United Parcel Service, and customers like that. The concept has been expanded, and I think even, for example, coal shippers have seen, I believe, and have indicated publicly in some cases, they've seen much more reliable, predictable service from the railroads. Now, obviously, there are always going to be problems, and we've had really difficult weather across the country in the last week, and it wouldn't come as a surprise to learn that rail service in different areas has been adversely affected, and so just as it has been for the airlines. And by the way, Dr. Stengel came from Boston, but he took the train, so he got here okay. And I must say, Mr. Ficker, the AAR congratulates the Knit League on its 100th year anniversary, and I was struck by the fact that I didn't know, if the originators gathered in Chicago in 1907, I rather suspect that many of them came by rail. But so I think there's probably been a nexus between.
There weren't many that flew.
Mr. Ficker, you're in touch presumably with customers of the railroads on a daily basis.
Yes.
Do you hear about?
I've heard things this morning.
Do you hear a lot about improvements in train scheduling and related service?
I think you have to look at this, Mr. Chairman, on a longer-term picture. Over the last 10 years, you've seen mergers take place and enormous downturns in performance in the rail industry as a result of those mergers. Whether you go back to BNSF, the BN Santa Fe, the UPSP, or the Conrail. At each junction, there was a significant downturn in service, resulting in loss of traffic, increase in the number of cars that private companies had to acquire. And then we came out of that in the late 90s, and then the unforeseen influx of traffic in 2003 and 2004, driven substantially by Asian imports, really impacted things to the point where San Pedro Bay was referred to as the D-Day fleet because ships could not make port because there were so many ships waiting to discharge and there wasn't enough capacity to take it away. That was not strictly a rail issue, that was a highway issue, that was a port issue, but a significant volume of traffic. So I think what we're seeing is improvement, but we're nowhere near back to where we were prior to the merger times of the early 90s, when service was much more predictable. I think to the expense of the merchandise shipper, the single car shipper, the intermodal service has improved substantially. I know that UPS pulled a great deal of its traffic away from the railroad industry in 2003, 4, and 5 because they couldn't meet their commitments to their customers, so they put it over the highway. I think some of that has come back. You would probably need to check with them to verify that. But overall, I think service is on an upward trend. But one of the things that we continue to talk about in our organization is value. It's not about pricing and cost. It's about what you get for your dollar. And I don't think that, unfortunately, as any market rises and falls, and all of our members live and breathe in commodity environments where prices fluctuate with supply and demand. And unfortunately, you've seen that hit the transportation industry very significantly over the last several years. But unfortunately, the value isn't quite there where it should be today.
Thank you. Mr. King, you had mentioned in the course of your remarks that there has been, I want to make sure I understand this correctly, a notion or a belief somewhere that the freight rail sector in the U.S. is not impacted by government regulation or profitability is not impacted?
Yes.
Can you expand on that?
It has to do with the prohibition that comes out of the Hope Natural Gas case against a regulatory scheme where the action of the regulator affects the measurement of the factors that go into establishing the regulated rate. In that particular case, it was the valuation of rate bases for, in this case, a gas pipeline company. The pipeline was hoping that they would make a market valuation. Well, of course, the value of the pipeline was a function of what rates it got out of the Federal Power Commission at the time, now FERC, and therefore it became circular. And this issue came up and as a result, every commission of the country that regulates a monopoly service uses book value for both its capital structure and for the rate base, that is the base against which the allowed rate of return is applied. And that was originally the case with revenue adequacy findings. The ICC, when it made its first series of revenue adequacy findings, based the compositing of the various components of capital on book values. Then in, I believe, the early 1990s, the ICC observed that most of the traffic, owing to the Staggers Act, had been freed from regulation and reached the conclusion that, that being the case, its finding of revenue adequacy would not significantly affect the value of the stock and therefore the capital structure that was used to composite capital elements. And so ever since, the ICC and now this board use market valuations. Well, what I was suggesting in my remarks is times have changed. The importance of monopoly or market dominant traffic has increased dramatically with the growth largely of coal and chemical shipments and with the increased profitability of the rates for those shipments. As a consequence, I think it's time to rethink that earlier finding by the ICC that this board's finding of revenue adequacy or inadequacy no longer affects the profitability of the railroads and therefore their stock valuations. I think now it does.
Thank you. I have some more questions, but I'll defer for the moment. Vice Chairman Buttrick.
Not quite sure how to ask this question, but it seems when accountants add up the numbers 2 and 2, they get 4, and when economists add up the numbers 2 and 2, they may not get 4. They may get something else. I'm trying to think down the road to what the board might do or what direction the board might go in. No offense, Commissioner Mulvey.
He just hung up some lawyer jokes.
He did? Yeah. Well, I thought I might try to add a little levy here.
Yeah, thank you.
In trying to add up what I've heard today, if the board liked Mr. King's idea of how this should be computed, the methodology can be computed, from what I heard from the professor and from you, Mr. Rosenberg, is that you'd be quite happy with with a result that would come down where Mr. King is right now. Is that accurate, or is that off the mark?
Speaking for myself, Dr. Hodder may have his own views.
Well, he's the economist. He's going to have a different view.
In part, are you going to the cost of equity or the cost of?
Well, I'm not saying where I'm going. I'm just asking you how you like Mr. King's conclusion here of what he would recommend. I'm just curious about Mr. King is pretty certain that he has the right idea here, and he may have the right idea. I don't know, but I'm just curious about whether you like his proposal or not.
We probably like where it ends up. We think there are probably other ways and probably sounder ways to get there, frankly. For example, on the cost of equity, the FERC at 2/3, 1/3, we don't believe that is fully thought out. It's very heavily weighted to the analyst projections, higher than is warranted. With respect to the capital structure, we think that the current equity-heavy weighting does not reflect honest and efficient management. That a proper structure would be more heavily leveraged, and so it might end up close to what what's based on book value. We would get there in a different direction, and also we would reflect the high proportion of operating leases as discussed in our prior evidentiary submission. Professor Hart?
Does FASB weigh in on that determination of whether you're expensing the leases or not? Is that a FASB rule, or is that something else?
I'm reasonably confident that the FASB calculation would say, an operating lease is an expense and not a debt. What I am saying is that Wall Street, and we provided information about that, will capitalize it. Also, in BNSF and UP for their annual reports, the Regulation G pro forma, if I have the term correctly, capitalize it as well. It looks like, although not all the information was there in terms of their incentive compensation, that they look for return on invested capital, and they capitalize it for that reason as well. I think it may be an example where the economic treatment does differ from the accounting treatment, and I'll leave it at that.
With regard to the cost of equity estimation, I guess I would counsel against going for shortcuts, because they may work okay for a while, but then they may cause a real problem. And so I would actually, I would go for a three-phase DCF approach, where you actually see, well, why am I giving it this weight? Because that's what comes out in the economically sound calculation. With regard to the book versus market value, economists really like market value. I can understand the legal argument about the circularity, and I guess my thought would be on that, you probably want to go for something like depreciated replacement cost, or something that would get you a value that was not going to be driven by what was happening to the stock price, but did not reflect the cost of something that was put in place 25 years ago.
Any rebuttal by anybody else? Mr. King, do you have a follow-up to that at all?
Well, I think efforts to develop depreciated replacement costs have foundered on what is replacement cost. And that has been a real difficulty when that methodology has been employed. It's not a bright line kind of methodology as it is when you go either to market or to book value.
Anyone else?
If I may, Vice Chairman, first of all, on the issue of the operating leases, if you look at page 11 of my submitted testimony today, we point out that WCTL's proposal of the board reclassify operating leases from an expense item to a debt item would flatly violate ICTA. WCTL acknowledges that kind of a classification would not be consistent with GAAP accounting, and Section 11161 of the statute tells the board to generally conform its cost accounting rules to GAAP to the maximum extent practicable, and it explicitly requires the board's rules governing revenue and expense accounting by carriers be, quoting, consistent with generally accepted accounting principles uniformly applied to such carriers, end quote. That's Section 11164. You didn't ask me directly, but I'll volunteer. The AAR will not embrace Mr. King's proposal. A number of the points that Mr. King made, he made them very eloquently. I compliment him for that. But he did say at the beginning, he's right. His firm in the transportation area represents shippers. He has a point of view. His partner, Mr. O'Connor, is known to you. He has been here in the small shipper context in the couple of mediated chemical company cases that you've had in the last couple of years. And he made a couple of points that I think Dr. Stangl had addressed that Mr. King did not respond to, including the lack of propriety in our view of comparing utilities to railroads, which he did, and a number of the figures he put up there for a single year, making comparisons to a lot of your numbers over longer periods of time. We were snapshotting a single year versus multiple year comparisons. I don't mean to speak for Dr. Stangl on that, but I listened to what he said, and I know he made that point.
Dr. Stangl, do you have anything you want to say, or were you satisfied with Mr. Mo's characterization?
Careful how you respond.
Well, you asked the question initially, Vice Chairman Buttry, about the FERC recommendation. It just seems to me that there are a whole range of possible changes that you might consider, and you ought to do it deliberately, including, keeping the method you have now or considering alternatives. But it's an important choice that you face, and I don't think you've gotten all the knowledge and expertise that you could gather on that question. So I would advise that you study it carefully.
Thank you. Commissioner Mulvey?
Thank you. That's the whole purpose of this hearing today, and why we are trying to elicit as much input as possible before we make a change in this very important procedure that the board does. I don't have any lawyer jokes. As an economist, I will point out what's pretty evident today, and that the old economist joke that if you laid all the economists in a line around the world, you'd never reach a conclusion. So I mean, that seems to be true here today as well. I will say, though, a couple of things. It was questioned about whether or not the board should be changing something like the way it evaluates the cost of capital and departing from a long-standing tradition of 25 years. But isn't it true that other agencies, in fact we heard from the Fed, I know also that the FERC has also looked at its approach and made changes over time. So isn't it important to look at the way we do things as time changes? Someone mentioned in their testimony that the fundamental economics of railroading have not changed, and that's true. But it is also true that economic conditions in the railroad industry certainly have changed, and that might cause us to look at the way we evaluate the cost of capital. Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, since I think I made those remarks, let me start, and perhaps I was misunderstood, and so I apologize. There's not a suggestion of any kind from the AAR that it's being critical of the board looking at the issue. It's an important issue. It's something that you might want to look at every couple of years going forward. My point, and the association's point, is that contrary to what these other commenters have suggested, there is absolutely nothing that has been presented to you in this record, or for that matter in the record in Ex Parte 558, that really does demonstrate that there is a flaw, let alone the term used, fatal flaw, in that DCF methodology that you have been using for about 25 years. The fact that it's been used and used effectively for that time, I think, is important. And I think I made the point earlier that because of the significance of regulatory certainty and the like, you would not lightly depart from that, as you presumably would not lightly depart from any other important regulatory philosophy or point that you had embraced in any other area. So we're not suggesting that as a matter of law you couldn't change it. We certainly are suggesting that we don't think there's anything in this record that even comes close to causing you to depart from it at this point in time. I could understand, and I'm hearing, there is genuine concern and interest in whether something more fundamental has changed in economics that makes the CAPM less difficult to implement than we frankly believe it is. I've heard economists refer to CAPM as theoretically elegant but almost impossible to implement effectively, frankly. Theoretically elegant is wonderful, and it's great in the classroom, but you're not in the classroom, and we're not either. We're trying to compete for capital, as I said before, in the real marketplace. So if that interest is there, my opening remark, I said I had understood your comments earlier this week in Ex Parte 558 to suggest that if you wanted to go forward, you would do that in a formal notice of proposed rulemaking. I assume that to be the case. And if that is the case, we obviously will participate in as helpful a way as we can. And I would expect that all the parties would likely offer you even more competing points of view from other, very impressive economists. And I think the gentleman from the Fed made it clear when they asked for comments, not just on the methodologies, but even on how to adopt a beta. They got comments from well-meaning, intelligent, experienced people all across the spectrum. And I think you can reasonably expect to see that too.